On the morning of June 28, 1778, near a courthouse in Monmouth County, New Jersey, a British officer watched a line of Continental soldiers hold their ground against a bayonet charge that 6 months earlier would have scattered them like leaves. Same men, same muskets. The muskets had not changed. The muskets were the same smoothbore flintlocks that had failed at Brandywine and failed at Germantown. What had changed was invisible. It was a sequence, a count, a rhythm hammered into their hands over 10 weeks at a frozen encampment in Pennsylvania, and it let those men put twice as many musket balls into the air per minute as the army they had been the year before. That is the whole story. Not a new weapon, not more men. A reload sequence drilled to muscle memory that doubled the speed of a firing line and, on several fields across 2 continents, decided who walked away. Here is what I am going to walk you through. First, the exact physical steps of loading an 18th century musket, and where in those steps most armies quietly wasted 3 to 4 seconds every single time. Seconds that add up to a soldier's life. Second, the specific man who arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778 spoke almost no English and rewrote the entire American drill manual around one idea. Third, the difference between firing by volley and firing by platoon, and why the slower-sounding method actually put more lead downrange. Fourth, the one moment in a battle where a faster reload does not just help, it inverts the outcome entirely, turning the losing side into the winning side in under a minute. And fifth, why this same reload discipline, not numbers, not courage, explains victories from the plains of Europe to the ridges of the Carolinas. I study military systems, the unglamorous machinery underneath the famous battles, how armies were fed, how they marched, how they loaded and fired. Because that machinery is almost always where the real story lives. And the reload, the single most repeated action a line soldier ever performed, is the most overlooked mechanism in the history of gunpowder warfare. To understand what changed, you first have to understand what loading a musket actually was. Picture a soldier in 1777, standing in a line, a flintlock musket in his hands. The weapon he holds is most likely a Brown Bess, the British land pattern musket, or a French Charleville that came across the Atlantic in the crates of French aid. It weighs about 10 pounds. It is nearly 5 feet long without the bayonet. It fires a lead ball roughly 3/4 of an inch across, a ball that weighs close to an ounce and travels at maybe 1,000 feet per second. That weapon does not fire on its own. Every single shot demands a fixed sequence of physical actions, and if he skips one or fumbles one, the weapon does nothing at all. He begins by half-cocking the hammer. Then he reaches to the cartridge box on his hip and pulls out a paper cartridge, a small tube of paper holding a lead ball and a measured charge of black powder, usually somewhere between 100 and 120 grains of it. He bites the end of the paper open with his teeth, and any veteran of these wars could be spotted in old age by the wear on his front teeth, the notch worn there by 10,000 torn cartridges. He pours a small pinch of that powder into the priming pan, the little shelf beside the barrel, and snaps the pan cover, the frizzen, shut over it. Then he swings the musket upright, pours the rest of the powder down the muzzle, shoves the paper and the ball in after it, and draws his ramrod. He rams the ball and wadding down the full length of the barrel until it seats against the powder. He returns the ramrod to its channel. He raises the weapon. He fully cocks the hammer. He aims. He fires. And in that instant, the flint snaps forward, scrapes a shower of sparks off the steel frizzen, drops those sparks into the priming powder in the pan, which flashes through a tiny touch hole in the side of the barrel and ignites the main charge behind the ball. And then, immediately, he begins the entire sequence again. A trained soldier could move through all of that in roughly 20 seconds if he was calm. But no soldier on a battlefield is calm. Smoke blinds him because black powder throws out a thick, greasy white cloud, and after 2 or 3 volleys, a firing line disappears into a fog of its own making, unable to see the enemy it is shooting at. Men fall on either side. The touch hole clogs with fouling, the residue of burnt powder caking harder with every shot until, by the 20th round, the barrel is half its usable width, and the ramming grows brutally hard. A line of bayonets is walking toward him at a steady pace, and every fumble, every dropped cartridge, every ramrod that jams is measured in his own survival. Under that pressure, the average soldier's rate collapsed to 2 rounds a minute, sometimes fewer. Now here is the detail that almost every popular account of these battles skips entirely. The sequence itself was not the problem. Every army knew the steps. The problem was that the steps were not synchronized. In an untrained unit, each man loaded at his own pace, in his own order, thinking through each motion as a separate decision. One man was biting his cartridge while the man beside him was still ramming. Another had already fired while a third was fumbling for his powder. The line did not act as one machine. It acted as 40 separate, panicking individuals, each losing 3 or 4 seconds to hesitation between steps, because hesitation is what the human mind does when it has to consciously choose its next move under fire. And that hesitation compounds in ways the arithmetic makes brutal. 3 or 4 seconds lost between each of 10 steps is 30 to 40 seconds bled out of a single reload. A soldier who should have loaded 3 times in a minute now loads once. And it does not stay contained in one man. A firing line is a social organism. The soldier who sees the man beside him still fumbling hesitates himself, unsure whether to fire alone or wait. The officer, watching the ragged line, holds the command longer, waiting for stragglers to catch up. The whole unit slows to the pace of its slowest, most frightened member, and then slows further as the confusion feeds on itself. That hesitation, multiplied across every step, across every man, across every volley, is where the firing line bled its speed. Not in the muscles, in the mind. And that is exactly the gap one man walked into at Valley Forge. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. He arrived at the Continental Army's winter camp in February 1778, having crossed the Atlantic with letters of introduction that inflated his resume considerably. Benjamin Franklin, working in Paris, had a hand in the embellishment, styling him a lieutenant general in the service of the King of Prussia. He presented himself accordingly. He had, in fact, served as a captain in the army of Frederick the Great and had spent time on the Prussian general staff, a small and elite body, before being discharged and drifting through years of unemployment, deep in debt, hunting a position in one European court after another. But whatever the paperwork exaggerated, the substance was real. Von Steuben had absorbed the single most disciplined military drill system in Europe, the Prussian method, from the inside. And he understood something that the Continental officers, brave as they were, did not. The army he found at Valley Forge was in a desperate state. Something like 2,000 of the men who marched in that winter would die there, not in battle, but of disease, of exposure, of hunger, in huts they built with their own hands out of a frozen Pennsylvania hillside. Men stood guard without shoes, wrapped in blankets, some without serviceable muskets at all. And yet, the deeper rot von Steuben identified was not the lack of supply. It was that there was no shared method. Regiments recruited from different colonies drilled by different manuals, or by no manual at all. A brigade transferred from one command to another had to be retaught from scratch because it did not load, march, or maneuver the same way as the men beside it. The army was not one army. It was a dozen armies wearing the same ragged coats. He understood that a soldier under fire cannot think. He can only execute what his hands already know. And so, von Steuben's entire innovation was to take the loading sequence and break it into a fixed, numbered, spoken cadence, drilled so relentlessly that the soldier no longer decided anything. He simply responded to a count. Load, handle cartridge, prime, cast about, ram. The motions became a single continuous chain, each step flowing into the next with no gap for hesitation to creep in, because the body was moving before the mind could interrupt it. He stripped the number of separate motions down, cutting away flourishes that older European manuals had accumulated over decades, ornamental movements that looked impressive on a parade ground and cost precious seconds in a firefight. Every motion that survived his revision earned its place by making the next shot come faster. Von Steuben did something almost no European officer of his rank would have done. In the Prussian and British armies, a general did not touch the drilling of common soldiers. That was work for sergeants, far beneath a man of his supposed station. Von Steuben ignored that entirely. He trained a model company himself, personally on the parade ground, in the cold, swearing at the men in German and broken French, while an aide, a young officer named Benjamin Walker, translated the curses into English. There is a famous letter in which von Steuben, exasperated, begs Walker to come and swear at the men for him, because he had exhausted his own supply of oaths in 3 languages and still could not make them understand. And the men, strangely, loved him for it. A European soldier flogged into obedience would never have seen a general lose his temper in the mud beside him. The Americans, who would not be driven, could be led, and von Steuben, almost by accident, discovered that the way to move them was to work among them. He took 100 hand-picked soldiers, drawn from across the army, and drilled them until the sequence was flawless. This was the model company, and it was deliberate. Rather than push a manual down through a chain of officers who might each dilute it, he built one perfect example first, a living demonstration that the method worked. Then, those 100 men fanned out into the regiments and drilled the rest of the army the same way, each of them now a walking template. Within weeks, the whole camp was moving to the same count. He wrote it all down in what became known as the Blue Book, the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, printed in 1779, and it standardized the loading and firing of every musket in the army into one shared rhythm. That book would remain the official drill manual of the United States Army for more than 3 decades, carried through the War of 1812. Its cadence outliving the man who wrote it by a generation. The result was not that the steps changed. The steps were the same steps. The result was that the 3 to 4 second hesitation between each step vanished, because the soldier was no longer choosing. He was flowing. And when you strip the hesitation out of a 20-second sequence, you do not shave a little off the top. You very nearly cut it in half. The Continental line went from roughly 2 rounds a minute to a sustained 3, and in good conditions, 4. Same men, same muskets, twice the fire. And beyond the speed, there was a second gift, harder to measure but just as real. A man whose hands know the sequence cold is a man with a place to put his fear. When the mind has nothing to do, it fills with terror. But a soldier reciting the silent cadence of the reload has his attention anchored to a task, and the task holds him in the line. When everything in him wants to run. But raw speed alone was not the whole of it, because von Steuben and the Prussian system behind him understood a second problem. And this is the difference between firing by volley and firing by platoon. Firing by volley is the picture most people carry in their heads. The entire line levels its muskets at once, and on a single command, everyone fires together. One enormous crash of sound and smoke. It is devastating for that one instant, a wall of an ounce of lead per man arriving all at the same moment, enough to stagger and sometimes shatter the front of an advancing formation. But then consider what happens next. For the next 15 to 20 seconds, while every man in the line reloads simultaneously, the entire unit is helpless. Not a single musket is ready. The line is a row of men looking down empty barrels, working their ramrods, utterly unable to answer a threat. If an enemy times his bayonet charge to hit in that window, he crashes into a line that cannot fire back, and there is nothing to stop him closing the last 30 yards but cold steel and nerve. And the reloading line usually loses that contest because a bayonet charge is designed precisely to arrive in that empty moment. Firing by platoon solved this. The line was divided into sections, platoons, and they fired in sequence rather than all at once. First platoon fires, then second, then third, then fourth. And by the time the fourth has fired, the first has finished reloading and is ready again. The effect is a continuous rolling wall of fire that never stops, a sound described by men who faced it not as a series of crashes, but as a single unbroken roll, like tearing cloth, like a drum that never rests. There is no vulnerable window. There is no moment when the whole line is empty. An officer commanding a platoon firing line could always answer a charge, because at any instant, some fraction of his men had loaded muskets ready to level. And here is the part that matters, the part that connects directly back to von Steuben's cadence. Platoon fire only works if every man reloads at the same reliable speed. If one platoon is slow, the rhythm breaks and a gap opens in the wall. A stretch of seconds where that section of the line falls silent and an attacker can pour through. The synchronized reload was not just about volume. It was the very thing that made rolling, continuous fire possible in the first place. The cadence and the platoon system were two halves of one machine, and neither half functioned without the other. A brilliant firing system laid over untrained hands produces only ragged noise. Disciplined hands with no system produce a hard punch and then a fatal pause. You needed both, and von Steuben brought both. So a faster reload drilled into a synchronized cadence did two things at once. It doubled the raw output of every musket, and it enabled a firing system that never left the line defenseless. Now watch what that combination does on an actual field. Consider a line infantry engagement of the period. Two forces face each other across open ground, perhaps 80 yards apart, both in formation, both firing. Numbers roughly even. The one variable that most often decided these standing exchanges was not courage, and it was not the accuracy of the individual smoothbore musket, which was poor past 60 yards regardless of who held it. A smoothbore has no rifling, no spin to steady the ball, and the ball itself is loaded loose enough to ram quickly, so it rattles down the barrel and leaves at an unpredictable angle. Contemporary tests found that a musket fired at a target the size of a company of men at 100 yards might miss with more than half its shots even from a rest, and a nervous man firing offhand in the smoke did far worse. Individual aim in that world was nearly meaningless. What mattered was throwing the greatest possible weight of lead into the general space where the enemy stood, and letting probability do the killing. The variable, therefore, was rate of fire. Think of it as arithmetic. If your line fires 3 rounds a minute and the enemy line fires 2, then in the first 60 seconds of the exchange, for every 2 volleys they land on you, you land 3 on them. 50% more lead, 50% more men falling in their ranks than in yours. And a firing line does not lose by fleeing all at once. It loses by degrees. Men fall. The survivors close the gaps, stepping over the dead to seal the holes torn in the formation. The line grows thinner. The volume of its return fire drops with every man it loses, which lets the faster line kill still faster, a spiral that accelerates against the losing side. And at some invisible threshold, the men still standing feel the line breaking around them, sense that too many of the familiar faces to their left and right are gone, and they run. This is the thing histories rarely name plainly. Infantry battles of this era were very rarely fought to annihilation. They were fought to the breaking point, the moment a unit's collective nerve failed. The faster firing line reaches that threshold second. The slower one reaches it first, because it is losing men faster, and its own answering fire, the thing that steadies a soldier's nerve, is thinning fastest. The slower line breaks, and the moment it turns, the exchange is over. A formation that turns its back is no longer a fighting unit. It is a crowd, and it can be ridden down by cavalry or bayoneted from behind. The faster line has not just won the firefight. It now has a fleeing enemy in front of it and a clear field. That is the inversion. In a firefight that lasts perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, a reload advantage of a single round per minute per man does not produce a slightly better outcome. It produces the entire outcome. The advantage does not add, it compounds, because every extra man you drop is a man who is not firing back, and every second of continuous fire holds your own line together while the enemy's dissolves. The faster line wins, and the slower line does not merely lose ground, it dissolves, and in dissolving, hands over the field, the wounded, sometimes the guns, and the moral victory that steadies the winner and unnerves the loser at the next encounter. You can see this logic play out at Monmouth, where the retrained Continentals, for the first time, stood in the open and traded sustained volleys with British regulars without breaking, holding a firing line the British had assumed they could never hold. It was one of the largest battles of the war, fought in appalling heat, temperatures near 100 degrees, men on both sides dropping dead from the sun as much as from lead. At one point, a body of Continental infantry stood and delivered volley after disciplined volley against advancing British grenadiers and guards, some of the finest infantry in the world, and did not give way. Von Steuben himself was on the field that day and watched the men he had drilled through the winter perform exactly as he had trained them, holding formation, loading and firing to the cadence, wheeling and reforming under fire. The men who ran at Brandywine stood at Monmouth. Nothing about them had changed except the rhythm in their hands. And this same mechanism, reload discipline as the true multiplier, echoes across military history well beyond the American Revolution. The reason the army of Frederick the Great, the very system von Steuben carried across the ocean, dominated the battlefields of 18th century Europe was not superior numbers. Frederick was almost always outnumbered, sometimes desperately so, a king of a small, poor, sandy kingdom surrounded by the far larger powers of Austria, France, and Russia. At Leuthen, in December 1757, he beat an Austrian army roughly twice the size of his own, and the Prussian infantry's ability to load and fire faster and to maneuver in the open at a pace their enemies could not match was at the heart of it. It was that his infantry could fire faster and more continuously than anyone they faced, through exactly this kind of relentless drill. His men were mocked for spending their peacetime marching and loading, thousands of repetitions of an action they might perform only briefly in an actual battle. The Prussian iron ramrod, which replaced the old wooden ones that snapped and warped, was itself part of this, letting a man ram harder and faster without fear of breaking his rod at the worst possible moment. But that mockery of the endless drill missed the point entirely. The repetition was the weapon. It moved the sequence out of the conscious mind and into the hands, so that when the smoke came and the mind froze, the hands kept working. And the same principle scales down to the underdog engagements this kind of story so often turns on. Give a smaller force a meaningful reload advantage over a larger one, and the arithmetic of attrition can erase the numerical gap entirely. A line half the size that fires twice as fast is, in the cold mathematics of the firefight, an even match, and sometimes better than even, because the faster line breaks the slower one before its numbers can be brought to bear. You can trace this down into the southern campaigns of the Revolution, into the fighting across the Carolinas, where Nathaniel Greene wore down a superior British army not by winning every battle, but by making every exchange cost more than the British could afford. At Cowpens, in January 1781, Daniel Morgan arranged his lines so that even his least reliable militia had only to deliver 2 good volleys before falling back, extracting the maximum controlled fire from men who could not be trusted to stand all day, and the disciplined Continentals behind them delivered the sustained fire that broke Tarleton's regulars in the open. The principle is the same one von Steuben drilled into the frozen ground at Valley Forge. Manage the reload, control the tempo of fire, and you can defeat a force that by every simple count of heads should defeat you. Here is the part that even careful histories tend to underplay. We remember battles by the names of their commanders and the boldness of their maneuvers. We talk about who flanked whom, who held the high ground, who charged at the decisive moment. But underneath almost every one of those standing infantry fights sat a quieter, more relentless truth. The side whose soldiers had loaded and fired 10,000 times in drill until the sequence lived below thought was the side that fired faster when it counted, and the side that fired faster in a straight exchange usually won. The maneuver got the credit. The reload won the fight. The general who flanked the enemy still needed his men, once they arrived on that flank, to load and fire faster than the men they surprised, or the surprise achieved nothing. The high ground helped, but the men on it still had to work their ramrods faster than the men climbing toward them. Underneath the celebrated decisions of the great captains ran this current of trained hands, and when the trained hands were absent, the boldest plan in the world ended in a broken, fleeing line. Von Steuben understood that the least glamorous action a soldier ever performs, repeated past the point of tedium, past the point of resentment, until it required no thought at all, was worth more than any speech, any flag, any moment of individual heroism. He took an army that knew how to load a musket and taught it how to load without thinking. And in doing so, he roughly doubled the fire of every man in the line, without adding a single soldier or changing a single weapon. Congress made him Inspector General of the whole army for the work. But the truer monument is invisible, the same kind of thing his innovation was. It lives in the fact that from that spring onward, the Continental Army could stand in the open field against the best infantry in the world and trade fire with them on even terms, something it simply could not do the year before. The muskets at Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 were the same muskets that had been there in the winter. The men were the same men, the survivors of that terrible camp. What von Steuben added was invisible, and it was decisive. A count, a cadence, a sequence drilled so deep that fear could not reach it. That is the reload trick that doubled a firing line's speed, and it is the reason the machinery beneath a battle so often matters more than the battle's famous names. If you found this worth your time, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more of this hidden machinery beneath the battles you think you already know.